Welcome to the Prophecy Club. Our topic today is Weapons of the New World Order by Nick Begich. Nick Begich discusses the latest developments in technology and its impact on humanity, freedom, human dignity, sovereign individuality, and self-determination. His topics are the HAARP Project, the revolution in military affairs and its impact on freedom, non-lethal weapons and their use and impact on people, such as radio frequency radiation, electromagnetic pulse, extremely low frequency fields, lasers and chemicals, environmental and weather control, new technologies which will eliminate privacy, militarization of law enforcement. Now, you can watch this and others available at watchprophecyclub.com. We've got over 300 DVDs up there, about 2.5 hours each, all for a gift of just $20 a month or $200 a year. Unsubscribe anytime you want to. WatchProphecyClub.com. 300 plus recordings, $20 a month, $200 a year. Go check it out. And also, Prophecy Club is in a jam right now, and if God has blessed you and you could help us, we would really, really appreciate it. Also, Leslie and I are going to minister in Honduras, so we'd appreciate your prayers, and also cutting these 2.5 hour recordings into these daily programs. Your support for that would be very welcome and appreciated also. If you're out and about and all of a sudden you need gasoline, you need food, and the credit cards aren't working, they aren't taking dollars, then one of the best things to have is right here. It's a prepper bar. Each one of these is a little bit bigger than a credit card. Will fit in your purse or your billfold, and it breaks into various pieces. So you could give them part instead of maybe more silver, more gold than you need to. Carry it right in your billfold or your purse. This particular one is 5 bars. You don't necessarily need to carry 5 bars with you, but you call 844-771-1776 or prophecyclubbar.com. prophecyclubbar.com. 844-771-1776.
The other thing that's important when we talk about mind control technologies, when you talk about something that's influencing behavior, that's one thing, and that's certainly interfering with free will. But let's take it another step. And an important part of this is as it relates to the HAARP activity, and I've got to tell you this story. This is a great story. People always underestimate, what our own potentials are. And I'll give you a couple examples of that. Somebody heard us on the radio one time, heard what we were saying, got hold of one of our books, read it, and sent it to a friend of theirs. Well, their friend turned out to be the chairman of the environmental subcommittee of the European Parliament. And he read it, and he went, this sounds pretty bizarre to me, and kind of reacted like I reacted the first time, but he did what I did. He went and checked it out, checked with his scientists, went to his military. This guy, Tom Spencer, goes to his military in Great Britain. He was a conservative from Great Britain. And he says, what's the story on this HAARP project? And they said, look, you really don't want to get involved in this. Stay out of it. It's, you just don't want to go there. And for Tom Spencer, that was the ticket to the dance. That was his invitation to get engaged. So he dug around. We went over and saw him. In fact, we made 4 or 5 visits to him. And then at one point, and that's too long of a story to tell, at one point we ended up on a ship together for 12 days. And in that time, we sort of laid out a plan of how do we take this information into a political body so that we can address it. And more than that, beyond HAARP, we wanted to deal with these other weapon technologies, which we felt were even more dangerous and more invasive, things that can influence our very behavior. As a result, he invited us, well, I got to go back a little bit. In the course of all of this, he got a new assignment. He became the Foreign Affairs Chairman, which is a very powerful position in the European Parliament. And so he decided that he would have a hearing in one of his subcommittees to address HAARP and broaden the agenda to include non-lethal weapons, such as the things we've been talking about so far today. And in that, he invited NATO. He went to the Secretary General of NATO. Now, this is the same committee that NATO went to when they wanted to introduce new member states to NATO. So they were a very important committee when NATO needed them. Now they go to the Secretary General and say, well, we'd like you to produce somebody to talk about ionospheric modification for weapons application, the stuff of HAARP, and we'd like you to talk about non-lethal weapons, the stuff of mind control and the like. And NATO says, we don't have a policy on either, and we're not going to appear. So Tom doesn't stop there because he's a very persistent guy. He goes to the American mission, our embassy in Brussels, and says, look, we want you to produce somebody to talk about your project, HAARP, and these other issues. And they wouldn't produce anyone. So he brought me in. He brought in someone from the International Red Cross, someone from Canada who was a physicist and an MD. In fact, this woman, Rosalie Bertel, was also a nun, and I don't know which order she was in. So you know, kind of a strange combination. You had a physicist, an MD, and a nun all in one body. And she was really good, and she was also the lead physician to investigate Bhopal after that huge event happened out there. So a very credible person. And then he brought in also someone from a group called GRIP, which was a group that deals with weapon systems based in Brussels. And what we did, and this is kind of interesting, the Europeans have a little different way of doing things. You know, we had delivered over those several visits hundreds and hundreds of documents, about 3 feet of documents we had delivered to the Europeans. And these are our allies, basically. So they had a lot of background material, they had a lot of information, and they were so incensed that the military would not show up, that NATO wouldn't show up, and the U.S. wouldn't produce anyone. They really wanted to have a good, solid hearing, and they were going to have it anyway. And so we met the night before. They shut down a restaurant, put us in there, 2 people from the media that they trusted, the committee members, and myself, and we went through our evidence for 5.5 hours. So they would be able to frame their questions in the public record the next day adequately to bring this issue out. So we went in, and the first thing we presented was a NATO document from NATO France on ionospheric modification for weapons application, the thing they didn't have any policy about, right? The other thing we brought in was something from the Strategic Studies Institute showing where NATO had deployed non-lethal weapons in events and conflicts in Europe. So we take in their own documents, essentially. Strategic Studies Institute is independent, but they're considered one of the most credible in the world. And their document from NATO France, one of the lead guys credited in that, was also attached to the HAARP program. So the idea that they didn't have a policy, we said, look, if they don't have a policy on these things, and what are they doing, deploying these systems and experimenting with them, it seems pretty reckless to us. Well, instead of the 15 minutes we were supposed to have, I had an hour and a half to present our case. The other thing we did as part of our presentation is we demonstrated an infrasound device. Now this is a device, and I'll explain how this works because it's going to get right into the next phase of this thing. An infrasound device is a device that converts sound information into a carrier that can transfer through the nervous system and arrive at the brain in the same way that a sound wave normally would. But this is the difference. A sound wave hits the outer ear, and this is your antenna array, this ear. If you close your eyes and someone jingles keys and walks around the room, you know, within a few degrees you can isolate, you know, where they are. But if you distort this and try it, you won't be able to isolate where they are because this is what's catching that first sound wave, is giving some direction. Then hits the eardrum, vibrates the eardrum slightly. There's 3 small bones in the inner ear. Those get vibrated slightly. There's a little bit of fluid that vibrates, and then it hits what's called the 8th cranial nerve. And what goes through the 8th cranial nerve is a little electrical signal that's digitized by that point because of all this activity on the outer ear. And that digital signal arrives at the brain through that nerve. The brain, they believe now, operates holographically. It picks out that code, that modulation, that little package of information, and you perceive sound. My voice, for instance, that you're hearing now. Now, if you can duplicate that modulation, that little package of information, and carry it in another way, and connect it to the nervous system, you'll hear the sound too, but it won't have any directional orientation. Now, the device we took did this. It used a piezoelectric transducer, which is a little disc that fits on the skin. It connects up, couples to the nervous system, and actually transfers the signal. So you can completely block your outer ears, and what you hear is a signal as if it were originating in the center of your head, inside your cranium, so that that's where the sound originated, and you would be hearing my voice just as clear as you're hearing it now. Now, when we demonstrated this, and infrasound devices were sort of in the literature, but these guys had never seen one. This was built out of stuff off the shelf, literally from a Radio Shack, and demonstrated that this capability existed. And the patent it was based on goes back to 1958. Now, when we showed them that got us this really important resolution passed because we wanted to get the stuff in on HAARP, and they gave us that. But then the main thing we wanted to make sure we had something that would stretch it into these more important, from our perspective, very much more important technologies. And this is what that portion of the resolution says. It calls for an international convention introducing a global ban on all developments and deployments of weapons which might enable any form of manipulation of human beings, unquote. Very important, in the sense that here's a political body that finally recognized technology exists. And when you think about how do countries get influenced, how do organizations get influenced, rule one, you preempt the leadership. You take out the leadership, right? I mean, if you want to stop a movement, you go after the people at the top and everything sort of falls away. Well, when parliamentarians sort of think about, what would be the effect of this system on me? I mean, ask yourself, if one of your favorite parliamentarians or legislators stood up and started talking about hearing voices in their head, sayonara, you're out of here. You wouldn't tolerate it. They'd be gone, right? At the same time, if they didn't say anything and they just were experiencing, wouldn't it be highly disturbing? In fact, I want to go to a military document. It's New World Vistas, Air and Space for the 21st Century. And it's put out by the Scientific Advisory Board to the Air Force. And if I can quickly find the quote, I'll read it, because it really lays out sort of another angle to this discussion that I think is quite compelling, if I'm fortunate enough to find it when I need it. Yeah, here it is. Again, this is an Air Force document, and this is the quote. It would also appear possible to create high-fidelity speech in the human body, raising the possibility of covert suggestion and psychological direction. Thus, it may be possible to talk to selected adversaries in a fashion which would be most disturbing to them, unquote. Now, wouldn't that be most disturbing if you were walking around and all of a sudden you got that voice in the head? And what's interesting is I was on a program, it was called Undercurrents. It's on CBC, Canadian Broadcasting System, one of their highest rated shows in Canada. That's their public broadcaster. And we did a special with a number of experts on mind control. And one of the experts was a guy named Smirnov, who works in the Russian Academy of Sciences. And he demonstrated this very same technology utilizing a medium that could be easily pushed through the internet. And what he said was that when you hear this, it's like hearing the voice of God. It cannot be resisted. Now, why is that? It's because it bypasses the conscious portion of the brain that filters out right and wrong, good and evil, lines things up with our experience, sort of dumps it straight into the brain where you begin to act on it. You're compelled to act on it. Now, Smirnov wasn't alone in that presentation. The other people that talked about this was a couple, I forget their first names, the Morrises. Now, they worked with a guy named D. Klein and a guy named John Alexander during the Bush-Reagan era, and evolved this whole concept of non-lethals. Now, they couldn't talk about what they did in the United States, but they had a chance to test this little device when they were on a trip to Moscow, and they testified in this tape and in a number of other sources that are quoted within the book about their experience that, in fact, it really does work, that you literally cannot resist it. And the way it was demonstrated for them was they ran it through the building that they were in, and what they told everyone to do was to bring at an appointed time little cakes, down to this office. Now, when you drink coffee or tea in Russia, it usually goes with little cakes. So at the appointed time, all these people from all over the place show up at the little cakes, as a demonstration. Well, the interesting part of all of it is that the idea of transferring voice information in this way is quite compelling. More than that, it goes even further, because what we used, you had to have a physical connection. What we know is that through microwaves or other carriers, you can carry that same signal in. If we had had a little more time and maybe 20 or 30,000 to play with that, we could have demonstrated that as well. And someday we probably will, because it's very compelling when you can show someone how it really works. It changes the whole perspective. And when you think about hierarchical structures, organizations, they tend to be, you take out the top and everything falls apart. The thing the military fears the most, the thing that most disturbs them in terms of outcomes, is what's called a leaderless revolution. And this is really sort of the subhead of all of this. What is a leaderless revolution? It's one without a head and one without a tail. You can't really stop it. It's when spontaneously a block of people get the same spiritual inclination and begin moving a certain direction and things start changing. Like what we couldn't do in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc countries in 40 years. All of a sudden, everybody kind of was in the streets. It was relatively nonviolent. It wasn't a violent thing. There wasn't any leadership to throw in jail. And what happened? What we couldn't do in 40 years, the whole thing collapsed in a matter of weeks and months because leaderless revolution couldn't isolate the leadership and get them out of circulation. The other thing that's important is what actually happened in that instance, or the instances in the Philippines when Marcos went down. The same kind of thing occurred. All of a sudden, spontaneously, people acted because they did a very simple thing. You know, faith, when I was growing up, and I can tell you, my route to become a Christian was not an easy trail, because the way my mind works, the way I think, wasn't an easy trail. It's too long to explain here, but I can tell you, it was a tough one, all right? Because I had to have proofs and evidence and all this stuff, because that's my nature. But the point is, what was the sort of the break point? I was raised originally a Catholic, and at point of confirmation, this is where you're supposed to know that you know. Well, I didn't know, and I told the priest I didn't know at that point in my life, and I wasn't going to do it. And there aren't a lot of Catholics that do that, you know. They kind of say, wait a minute, I don't want to do this because I'm not going to lie to myself, first of all, and then lie to you, second of all. You know, and that was where I was at 12 years old. But what that priest told me that was interesting, he said, you know, he tried to get in this long discussion about what faith was, you know, which was really confused the heck out of me. Because for me, what I have learned is faith is a very simple thing. It's not a very complex thing. Faith is acting on what you know to be right and true and stepping into it. You know, sitting on the bench, warm in the pew with no action, nothing is happening there. Faith is demonstrated by stepping into the game and doing something about what you know to be right and true, and not with a lot of anxiety and tension and all that, because God doesn't give us things that we can't handle. It's with pure confidence that you know that by making that step in that direction, that you'll get what you need to do what you need to do in terms of your work. Whether it's something as complicated as what this all might appear to be, or something quite simple. And there's a human butterfly effect. You know, that butterfly effect, a little bit of energy in, huge things out. You never know what it's going to do. You might be walking down the street someday, and it may be as simple as smiling at the guy walking the other direction, and that simple thing might actually change that individual's life. Maybe they didn't think anybody cared about them, and maybe that little simple thing could have that profound effect. And I believe that. And I'll give you another example. Remember that person heard us on the radio, decided to do something with the information, stepped into the game, and look what came out of it. Tremendous thing. I mean, I never would have expected. Somebody told me I'd be standing here today and have followed the trail I followed in the last 7 years. I'd have said, you're out of your mind, you know, because it just doesn't look that way when you start down that trail. But every time you take one of those steps, eventually you look back behind you, there's a whole trail, and you go, wow, I couldn't have mapped that one out any better if I had tried. And you didn't. And I think that's it. It's a step of faith. You know, the faith of a mustard seed, a real small thing, creates a real big thing. It's the same idea here. You got to do something. You got to act some action to it and recognize where that real truth lies. Along that line, you know, when we look back, there's a couple other things that are kind of other examples of it. There was a guy that wrote me from Germany. He worked in a mail room, you know, a mail room in the bottom of a big business. And he wrote me a letter and he said, you know, I really liked your book because he saw it, he read it in the Munich library. He goes, what can I do to help you? And I said, I really need a German publisher because Germans are real important for these issues in Europe. So this guy thinks about who's the best publisher in Germany for our book. Now he takes up his copy, which was kind of marked up sort of like mine, and chases somebody, figures out who it is in this bureaucracy and sends his copy of the book over and follows up with the phone call, chases the guy down and says, you know, will you read it at least? And he goes, yeah, I'll read it in the next couple months. I'll get back to you. 3 days later, the guy called me. 5 days later, we had an agreement. The next day after the agreement, he had 5 translators on the book and an MD, and it was in print and available in Germany 3 months later, which anyone who knows anything about publishing, that's a phenomenal pace to translate a technical title. The same thing happened. We wanted Japan. You know, you get Germany, Japan, and the US. You can really kind of cover big chunks of what happens to influence policy. In Japan, it was interesting. As a guy, he's a mortician in California, read our book. Send it to somebody he knew. Same thing happened. We ended up with our book in Japanese. I can give you dozens of examples like that because we always underestimate what we're all capable of. It takes a step. May not be this issue. Might be something else. Everyone in this room has something near and dear to your heart that requires some little bit of action. And in doing so, tremendous things can become possible. In looking at sort of where does it go from there? One of the other things that shows up in New World Vistas Air and Space for the 21st century is sort of the ultimate on where mind technologies may someday go and may very shortly go, is the idea of being able to remove a memory and give you a new one, a synthetic memory. Now, from a military perspective, this would be great for training, right? Instead of learning all this stuff for weeks and months, it'd be nice to just download that information. We are not that far off. The problem there is, from my perspective, it may sound real interesting. I mean, what if you could learn a foreign language in a few hours? That might be kind of exciting. Here's something to think about. And I don't know whether Stan mentioned it when he introduced me, but I also was past president of the Alaska Federation of Teachers for 2 terms and the Anchorage Council of Education for 2 terms, teachers' organizations. I'm the only teachers' organization president that I know about that ever served in that capacity that favors vouchers. Now, why would I favor vouchers? Because I'm smart enough to know that what the public system is doing, what the state does to download into our kids with the current curriculum is somewhat damaging, severely damaging in some cases. But the idea that the state knows better than the parent, I have a real hard problem with. But the other aspect of it is military technology eventually translates into private sector. Now think about this as an educational tool. Who will control the curriculum if this type of technology migrates into the private sector? Who will decide for that first 16 years where children are required to be educated, and most people can't afford private education or homeschooling, they can't do it because they're working 3 jobs to make 1 living already. Who's going to control the curriculum that goes into kids' heads? Bearing in mind that when you dump information in utilizing these tools, you bypass the conscious filter, what's right and wrong. So what you establish is the moral base under which the country operates. Very dangerous technology. We cannot wait until it's here. We need to deal with the technologies now. Now that's one area. You know, we've covered quite a bit, but we've covered very little in terms of what's in this title. I want to jump to some other subjects because otherwise we're not going to get very much covered. Let's talk about sort of where some of the other technology goes, and I want to talk a little bit about going back to sort of energy weapons and the bigger concepts of weaponry, because this whole concept is wrapped around the idea of a revolution in military affairs. Now, this is the military's concept. It was first raised in a document by the same name by the U.S. Army War College. And what they talked about, this is back in 1990, the revolution in military affairs was a change in the context in which war would be fought that was so profound, they equated it to the development of atomic weapons earlier this century or the introduction of gunpowder to Europe in the Middle Ages. In other words, it would change the very face of warfare. And this concept is centered around the idea of electromagnetic warfare, the use of electromagnetic fields to affect hardware and software, living organisms, in an adverse way. One of the things that jumps out, and we've heard little bits and pieces, and you know the thing about a lot of this is people go, well, I remember that, or I remember this, and over the course of time we remember lots of it, but when it comes out over 40 years, a slice at a time, it doesn't have the same effect. It's the old story, you know, you throw a frog in a pot of water and you turn the heat up, and as it boils, he just sits there until he boils to death. But if you throw him into a pot of boiling water, he's going to jump out. This is the pot of boiling water. Because when you see it in one place, you go, wait a minute, it's gone way too far, it's time for a change. And this is, again, sort of where does it go? Well, electromagnetic warfare, we talked about weather modification, we talked about effects on human beings, but there's some new weaponry. One of the things that came out, if anyone watched CNN today, they saw this thing about START 2 getting signed off by the Duma, the lower house of the Russian parliament. And START 2, one thing they said, though, today that was really interesting is that they'll agree to that, but they will not agree to a modification of the ABM treaty from 1972. This is a treaty that requires that each country can only have one defense system against nuclear attack. Okay? Now, the important thing here is when I go back to that hearing I testified at in the European Parliament, I said to the parliamentarians back in 98, early 98, I said, the United States will unilaterally scuttle the ABM treaty. And they'll do it on the rationale that there is no Soviet Union and therefore there is no treaty. Now, when I got done with our whole presentation, that was the one point parliamentarians came after me on. They said, there's just no way. We're their allies. They're not going to do that without telling us. And I said, you have 18 to 24 months and it's going to happen. You need to act on these issues now. I was wrong. It took 9 months because in the Federal Register, and we covered in the book, the U.S. announced that we were going to deploy a new missile defense system. In fact, we've already spent $6.6 billion developing it. And this system would be deployed in Alaska, which is what we said. And more than that, we said that the argument that would be used, this is exactly what our senior Senator Ted Stevens, who chairs the United States Senate Appropriation Committee, the most powerful appropriation committee is. I mean, it gives out the money. It determines the budget for the greatest part. He said there is no Soviet Union, therefore there is no agreement. Now, needless to say, that agitated the Russians, that agitated the Chinese, and agitated our allies. And we traced the history in the book of where everybody ran around to try and smooth it over. But today, as recently as today, it comes up again in the mainstream media, as this is one point the Russians will not give on. And to demonstrate it, most of you probably didn't connect it all, but they actually fired off of one of their nuclear submarines a missile back into their own country to demonstrate they still had that capability, because what is clearly known is a shield generally is thought to not be possible to work at all for a submarine that's close in U.S. waters launching, because there's no time to fire up the system. Now, what they're also doing, and they're talking about, and I can tell you it's bogus, is they're talking about the idea of using ground-to-air missiles to intercept these ICBMs, these intercontinental ballistic missiles. Now, think about this. You stand on one side of the room and I'll stand on the other, and we'll both shoot a bullet and we'll see if we can hit the bullets, okay? Because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about hitting a bullet with a bullet. One of the leading scientists on this just a few weeks ago came out public and said it won't work, and the tests that they've run have been manipulated to give good results, and this will not work. And from a cover story standpoint, it's an interesting story, but there's some better technologies out there. In fact, this is really interesting because, you know, when you read things at the first blush and you go, wait a minute, is that really there? And here's one that comes from the Department of Energy. And you got to remember, the United States Department of Energy used to be the Atomic Energy Commission. You know, the guys that brought us to Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb. So you got to kind of think about it in this context. These guys own this technology from 1990, and it's U.S. patent number 4959559. And I'll just read you one line out of it because it's really compelling, and I'll explain what the heck it says. It says, the invention relates generally to the transmission of pulses of energy, and more particularly to the propagation of localized pulses of electromagnetic or acoustic energy over long distances without divergence. Now, what does that mean? Without divergence is the idea that normally when you think about that kind of energy, you think about it spreading out, becoming very, very less concentrated the further it goes. Now they figure out a way to keep it all together. Now, when you think about this, what's important, and then I'm not going to read the next section, I'll just tell you what it says. In the next section of the patent, it's a U.S. government patent, they equate this to a photon torpedo right out of Star Trek, right? You know that little blob of energy that shoots across? Okay, that's what they compare it to. It's really interesting, except the difference is when you shoot a blob of energy through the atmosphere, it's traveling at about 186,300 miles per second. That's the speed of light. This is traveling maybe just slightly below the speed of light, as opposed to 30,000 miles an hour, which is the speed of an ICBM. So the idea of hitting a bullet with a blob of energy is much more realistic because you can get several off, you can triangulate the position, period. That's the type of technology we're going to see. We hear about lasers, because lasers are speed of light weapons. You know, that's what they are. There's a light beam. It's going at the speed of light, 186,300 miles per second. Zing. But you got to get a lot of energy. And they haven't been able to quite figure that out with lasers yet. There are some big ones, but they weigh a lot. They're not the kind of things you can put in a satellite. They're not the kind of things you can easily put on the ground. This type of technology is the other half of the ICBM shield system that we'll eventually see deployed, because the other is strictly a ruse. When you look at the press reports and we cite them of what the Chinese were saying, they started talking energy weapons as soon as we started talking about unilaterally scuttling that treaty. And why that treaty is important is because it's a foundational treaty that most of our allies have relied on. From my perspective, I live in Alaska. Now, Alaska and Hawaii under the existing shield are not covered. Now, Alaska produces 25% of domestic oil, which is critical. Hawaii, as we all know, is the center of the Pacific Fleet, very critical strategically. I want to see these regions protected, believe me. The point is, with these kinds of systems, we may be creating bigger problems than those that we're trying to guard against. We need to walk very carefully when man plays God by manipulating the environment in a very specific way for weapons applications. We need to make sure that we're doing it right and that we're not going too far. And this has not been done. The public debate has not been there for these systems adequately to convince us that they can be done safely. Energy weapons in terms of high-powered lasers and pulsing energy is a very important concept, and I want to explain this concept. And it comes out of an article from the Los Angeles Times, and there's some patents to cite it, but let me just paraphrase it and explain what it means. If you take the energy of 2 car batteries, okay, it's not very much energy, right? But you take that energy and you compress it and you release it in 150 billionths of a second, 150 nanoseconds, just this little short amount of time, it equals the generating capacity of the United States by 20 times because you compress that energy and you release it in a very, very short amount of time. That creates a tremendous surge of energy, pulse of energy. Those are the kind of things that are used for knocking out electronics, but with very high efficiency because in that fraction of a second, you've bursted that energy out. But we're talking 2 car batteries there. Now this device was actually built by a guy in his garage that demonstrated this. And it would knock out everything. In fact, I got to find the quote now, and it says, it could take the energy contained in 2 car batteries, compress it and release it in 150 billionths of a second, thus exceeding in those 150 nanoseconds the electrical generating capacity of the United States by about 20 times. In so doing, Aurora simulated the high energy gamma rays that could scramble the electronic controls of everything from toaster ovens to guided missiles, unquote. And it's called, the article is Cold War Doomsday Machine Meets Own Dooms, Los Angeles Times, March 1996. Interesting. Because that's the whole principle under pulsing energy. Now think about things like HAARP that have an effective radiated power of 1 billion watts. Or think of even smaller systems that might be mounted on trucks that might have, you know, the equivalent of 100 car batteries. You're talking about tremendous, tremendous amount of energy. I want to go back to a couple other concepts. In terms of mind control, one of the things about the Gulf War that we heard about, you know, was how did we do this? You know, all these guys running out panicked, and the story was, well, we bombarded them with so much ordnance that, you know, they just gave up. It never washed well with me, because I think about Dresden, Germany in World War II. I think about London in World War II, where every day and every night bombs are going off. Nobody was doing that. But we suspected, but we didn't know until a couple of years, several years actually, after the conflict ended. It showed up in the Scottish press. They were using what is called a silent subliminal that was embedded on the radio broadcast played in the region. Now the radio broadcasts were playing the music, the Muslim music and the Muslim prayers that everybody was dialed into. And underneath it, silent subliminals that created panic and fear. Now the same technology, we cite the patent where it came from, which gives it a little bit more meat to hang on the bones of that idea. But then the commercial aspects used in Japan right now, where they're playing in department stores, you know, the elevator music that you're listening to when you're in department stores. Well, underneath it in 7 languages, they have little messages to dissuade shoplifters. And they've been able to chart, you know, their progress. Very successful program, you know, and it's great they're dissuading shoplifters, but, you know, God forbid that they get into a situation where they need more sock sales and they get you to buy 10,000 pairs. The point of the matter is, again, whether it's used for that purpose or some other purpose, there is never, ever a reason why or an excuse for manipulating the free will of any living soul. God won't do it, man shouldn't do it, and when he does, he commits one of the ultimate sins. He violates the very essence of who we are as created images of God by affecting us, doing something that even God would not interfere with. And yet man, for commercial reasons or for military reasons, would seek to do that. We have to oppose that. The idea that, well, you know, would they really use it against Americans? The answer is yes. And I'll tell you, the toughest chapter to write in this book was on human experimentation. It was hard, because as we looked at each thing, and Secretary of Energy O'Leary made the statement that over 500,000 Americans had been experimented on by weapons technologies over a 40-year period. 500,000, that's how many they admit to, without their consent. Now this involved several things. Black Americans in the southeastern United States being injected with syphilis to see how they would die over time. Native Alaskans being injected with radioactive iodine to see how they might be affected over time in Arctic and subarctic conditions. Service personnel given LSD and other drugs to see what would happen. Or worse, placed inside of trenches while atomic blasts went out in harm's way to see how it might affect them over time. School children sprayed with chemicals, biological agents to see what would happen and how disease spread through populations. We cite the sources, we cite their own documents that lay that bare. The idea they would do it, would they do it today? Think about the anthrax vaccines that they wouldn't license for general use. Think of some of the other vaccines used in the Gulf War that they wouldn't allow for general use. And yet they're experimenting on service personnel, and a failure to say yes, what does it mean for those guys? They get booted out of the military with dishonorable discharges. Maybe they go to jail because they don't have the right to say, I don't want this under my skin. And yet, they don't have the same political rights you and I have either. They can't object in the same way that we can object. Yet, the people that we're asking to risk their lives, we're asking to risk their lives twice and to remove their choice about what goes on in their bodies. This is a fundamental flaw. And yet, the only people that can advocate for them is you and I, because they don't have the same privilege to object that you and I have. And yet it continues to this day. We need to buckle up, belly up, and say, listen, tell our congressional delegations, let people decide what goes under their skin and not the government. Let people decide, military personnel decide what's safe and what isn't. One of the other things that showed up in Revolution in Military Affairs and Conflicts Short of War was the idea of injecting transceivers under the skin of military personnel. This is from 1990. So that if they were caught in a prisoner of war situation, we could locate them easily with geographic positioning systems, GPS systems. But they didn't stop there. They also suggested that any American traveling overseas should also have one of these transceivers. Because after all, you know, it's a volatile world, and if something happened, we'd want to get you out. But don't worry, we won't turn them on until you leave the country. The whole idea, again, is where do we draw the line? There's a lot to say about privacy, and one of those things is what goes on under our skin, we should be deciding, not our government. What goes into our children's heads and our heads, we ought to be deciding, not our government. The idea in the Revolution of Military Affairs and Conflicts Short of War went even further, and they suggested that the new technologies that were coming would violate American principles and value to the extent in which Americans would object to their deployment. And they said instead of stopping there where you think they would stop, they said we need to change American values. And they created two scenarios to do that. One was to create villains, international drug traffickers and terrorists who we would look the other way when their civil rights were violated, because after all, you know, they're big threats, the same way people thought about Jews in Germany before World War II. Because the fact of the matter is, under our system of justice, you're innocent until proven guilty. That if you suspect someone of a crime, and one of the things they suggested was we could knock out their aircraft using these new weapons, cause them to crash. And what happened if the guy who received the message heard the message as terrorists when it was really an airplane load of tourists? Could that happen in our government, as efficient as all those people are? Of course it could. The fact of the matter is, they suggested that because it was outside of the country, the Constitution wouldn't apply, and that is again wrong. When our service personnel swear an allegiance to that Constitution, it goes where they go. They represent who we are. They represent our values. They don't change our values. They represent our values in a way that we can be proud of. And the idea of presumption of innocence, juries, trials, we did not make them judge, jury, and executioner. We have to insist that those civil liberties apply in all instances, or we stand for absolutely nothing. The United States has the opportunity, if they can detect all of this, follow them until they land and arrest them and give them their due process of law. Because where you start drawing that line artificially, we all are in trouble. When you think about who's tagged as an adversary, it's anyone who stands against American policy. whether it's protesters at the WTO in Seattle, protesters in Washington, D.C. this week, objecting to the World Bank and the World Trade Agreements there. The fact of the matter is, we have a right to carry our agenda. Our government should reflect that agenda in its public policy. And when it tries to influence the behavior of Americans to further their own political ends, it is fundamentally wrong and violates every aspect of our Constitution and American way of life. These systems go much, much further. There's a lot to be said in terms of privacy issues and these issues that are now upon us. And we need to reframe our thinking in a way that takes us to a much, much better conclusion. The next issue I want to cover really gets into some of the privacy questions and some of where this new technology goes in terms of privacy issues. But just before I do that, I'd like to talk a little bit about some more of the positive side of some of this science, because I think that's very important to see sort of the flip side of this equation. One of the things that comes up with mind-altering technologies are there things that might be beneficial or might be good? And you know, there's a couple of things I want to talk about in terms of other forms of mind control that are a little more obvious to most people. The use of chemical compounds, Prozac, Ritalin, the things that we hear a lot about when it comes to small children and even adults, some of the most prescribed medications in the country. And these are really about changing human behavior, right? These are about modifying human behavior. And there was an initiative during the Bush administration that was pushed forward, and this initiative was the idea they were going to go in. It was supposed to be funded by $400 million. They were going to go into inner city schools, isolate out the people that were demonstrating rebellious kind of characteristics or non-conforming characteristics. And they had decided, this group of psychologists, that these types of characteristics manifested because of some genetic basis. In other words, these folks that were maybe with a tendency towards criminal behavior, it was genetic rather than choice. In other words, it was just another illness. Pretty bizarre. I mean, the whole idea, it goes back to Nazi Germany when they thought the same thing. The fact is, what they wanted to do was go in and test young people, interview parents at length, interview teachers at length, and then medicate inner city young people on a mass scale to modify their behavior. Now, let me say this, that when I was young and in school, I challenged authority quite a bit, because it was my nature, you know, to ask questions, and you know, and I felt that teachers ought to have answers, and if they had sort of pat answers that really weren't answers, you know, I wasn't satisfied with that. Now the difference is, I was lucky I had very good teachers. I was blessed by teachers that understood that that kind of inquiry wasn't a challenge to them, and they were secure enough in knowing what they knew to not feel uneasy about that. But the same characteristics that create leaders can create criminals. It depends upon how their energy is organized. If you take people that don't conform out of the picture and you not only dumb them down, but now you numb them down, you've got a problem in your next generation of leadership, because these are people that don't conform in the traditional way of conforming. They always challenge. They want more information. You know, they're inquisitive. These are the very people that you want to get them to think in the right direction by giving them incentive to head a different direction. The reason I bring that up is when you think about mass drugging of the country, fortunately it was stopped. There were a number of psychologists that found that this whole concept of genetic correlations between behavior was ridiculous. But even in the most recent news this year, we're hearing this come up again 7 years later, being posed in the mainstream. I remember hearing Brokaw one evening saying, you know, isn't it interesting that we might be able to solve crime as a genetic problem? This is dangerous business in terms of what could happen. But talking about sort of the other side of it, when you're using Ritalin or one of these drugs to take a hyperactive child and slow them down, or take a child whose brain activity is not fitting into the right frame to pick it up, you really don't get the result you want. You get kids that are kind of in a fog, not really focused. There's other ways to achieve this. Now, you and I naturally, when we sit down and we read a book, our brain activity flows into that right frame to where we can take the material in, remember the portions we need to remember. We do it naturally. Well, a lot of young kids don't do that naturally. And there's a number of reasons why. I mean, there's a lot of environmental factors that contribute to the problem. But one of the things that's been found to be quite useful is a thing called brain biofeedback. Now what that is essentially you're hooked up to an EEG, these things that connect on the outside of the skin that measure brain activity, and it's fed directly into a computer so you see in real time on the screen in front of you what your brain is doing. Now for little kids, they don't want to see a bunch of squiggly little lines. So they design software that maybe has a bouncing ball. And when they bounce the ball at the correct level by fooling around with their own brain activity and the way they focus their attention, they learn how to bounce that ball so that their brain wave activity is in that frame where they can learn. And what they found is after 30 or 40 sessions of about an hour apiece, most kids can learn how to focus their attention and learn without Ritalin or any other drug and do what we do naturally. In fact, do it a little bit better than what we do naturally because they're trained very specifically. And the difference is they're directing it, not someone else. They just learn how to exercise that muscle, if you will, the brain, in a way that allows them to learn how to focus that attention. Very, very powerful in terms of what we can do. Now, why wouldn't the pharmaceutical industry be too excited about that? It's pretty obvious, It's all about money. The thing about it is that's an expensive therapy. Now, everyone in this room, everyone who hears this video is going to say, I know someone who's hyperactive or has a hyperactive kid or has an attention deficit disordered kid. I want to know what we can do. First of all, this therapy is expensive. It's not inexpensive to tie up a clinical psychologist for an hour or a biofeedback practitioner for an hour 30 times. But I'll tell you the organization, there's an organization, it's a Biofeedback Association. They're based in Denver, Colorado. They're in their yellow pages. They have practitioners that are certified all over the country. It's something that communities need to pull together, churches need to pull together. When we have those kids, find a way to get them the treatment, get them off of that Ritalin, get them off of the drugs that are really hurting them and damaging them. The biggest injustice, the biggest inhumane aspect of these weapon systems are the technology that's being developed for military applications is denied to health practitioners, the very people that need this knowledge that could revolutionize medicine in this country. When you're talking about systems that can kill, you're also talking about the same systems that mean that we've learned enough about our physiology, our internal makeup, to perhaps change the shape of medicine. And I would suggest that in our lifetimes, we're going to see electromedicine as a concept become more and more mainstream. It already is in many parts of Europe and other parts of the world. It's going to be here, and it's going to lend itself to some great, great changes. The other thing I want to talk about as it reflects on all these technologies is the effect on young people in terms of military personnel. Think about what military personnel go through in their upbringing today. First of all, they're exposed to unprecedented volumes of violence through the media, through television, all the things that deliver violent messages and sort of desensitize children, young people, to violence in and of itself. Then we enter the battlefield environment. Now think about the Gulf War. The Gulf War and the direct conflict, over 100,000 people on the other side died, and in the direct conflict, a couple hundred on the U.S. side died. Pretty extreme ratios. Now take a look at Kosovo, where tens of thousands on the other side died, and virtually no one on the American side died in combat. Now, why is that? It's because our technology is taking us further and further from the engagement itself. So now, sitting at the end of a computer terminal is a guy playing the equivalent of a video game, delivering ordnance into the battlefield, delivering weapon systems to the battlefield that are killing thousands of people. Now the difference is when our fathers and grandfathers came back from battle, they had the smell of death still in their nostrils and a desire to not see their children and grandchildren engaged in the same thing. Because we all recognized that that's the last thing we ever want to do. Sometimes a country's called into those conflicts. But if it becomes easier and easier to engage in those conflicts, we'll be engaged in many, many more than perhaps we should be. We're making conflict and killing too easy. We're taking the humanity out of it. And we're conditioning this next generation to accept that as okay. This is one of the greatest sins, is to kill. We have to exercise a decision on whether or not we kill for our own defense, whether or not it really is our own defense, or are we protecting the interests that are quite contrary to the American value systems, to American interest? Are we just protecting multinational interests, corporate interests, economic interests that work against us as much as they work against other countries? We need to ask about the engagements we're engaged in, and we need to ask about the direction in which our wars are fought. And we need to find ways to make sure we maintain the absolute toughest decision-making matrix when we decide to get engaged. We just can't get involved in every conflict for economic reasons. It's just fundamentally wrong. Going back to sort of where some of these technologies go, and this is one of the big concerns, is one of the things that the military is very concerned about is the media attention to conflict. Because obviously, as we saw in the Gulf War and we saw in Kosovo, as soon as the photos start coming back, we all get real excited because we don't like the idea of particularly innocent civilians getting killed. And it happened in both conflicts. I mean, we can go back and look at all those photographs and think about it, and it ends up shutting down the effort. So getting the media removed, non-lethal weapons are one of the things that they came up with, because if there's nothing to photograph, there's no carnage to photograph, then it doesn't make the 6 o'clock news and doesn't generate the kind of concern that people with values, ethics, and morals might have when they watch people get slaughtered.
What you've been watching here is us cutting a 2.5-hour DVD into 30-minute segments, but you can watch all of it at watchprophecyclub.com, where you can watch some 300 other DVDs, 2.5 hours each, $20 a month or $200 a year at watchprophecyclub.com, watchprophecyclub.com. And Prophecy Club is in a bit of a financial jam right now, so if you can help us, if God has blessed you, if you feel like Prophecy Club has blessed you, then we could really use your help. Thank you. Okay, the very best offer we have ever had at the Prophecy Club is 40 books for a gift of $100. That is How Pre-Trib Won, Tribulation Secrets in Daniel, God's Warnings to America, Miss the Mark, and The Secret Door to Understand Bible Prophecy. I'll explain. As I've said many times, in 2017, I memorized the book of Revelation. I got 30 revelations, 2 visions, and an audible voice. God showed me a secret door, the word first fruits, which is found in Leviticus and also Revelation, that links the feasts to the prophecies of Revelation. And perhaps for the first time, Revelation can be understood. One prophetic word said, there's a lock. I put over a word in the book of Revelation. I'm going to open it to you. It will turn many books written on the end time message into obsolete books. That's this book. Secondly, I put together a collection of the very best prophecies from 32 years in Bible prophecy: Dimitri Duduman, Michael Boldale, Leslie Johnson, Henry Groover, Shane Warren, Terry Bennett, Maurice Sklar, Augusto Perez, Doug Metzger, Bree Keaton, and more in God's Warnings to America. Also, how do you talk to people about the mark of the beast, especially if they worship another god? Well, simple way is give them this book. It's a quick read, takes about 3 hours to read it, but if they'll read 2 or 3 pages, they'll probably read the book, and if they read the book, they will never take the mark of the beast. It explains both the mark of the beast and also the number of the name, and it has these pictures in the book. Finally, How Pre-Trib Won. This book explains the truth about the rapture. It gives 4 foundations for the real truth about the rapture. It also answers 25 pre-trib questions, 1 for $20, each one of these typically, but don't do that. We offer them in shrink-wrap sets. The very best deal is go to prophecyclub.com and get the entire 40-book set for $100. I didn't cover every verse in the book of Daniel, didn't need to. I just covered the verses that has to do with us end-time saints. And it's called Tribulation Secrets in Daniel, 1 for $20, 10 for $30, 20 for $50 at prophecyclub.com.